Alexander 10, June 3rd, 61,613 BC. She had done it. One of Tuala's vertebrate lines had evolved into an intelligent species, and they were magnificent. They had descended from a furry line of grassland-dwelling creatures, but they had lost much of their fur. Their brains were fairly large proportional to their bodies because they long ago stood upright on two legs, allowing for a heavier skull given that it could be stabilized. They had 2 arms, and all 4 appendages had on them 4 digits each. They were very much like the humans of Earth who were evolving alongside them across the stars. One of the great differences between them was that their number system was based on cyclical repetition of sets of 8 and not 10. It didn't make for such a fundamental difference. It just meant that conversions were in order to make their respective views of mathematics translatable. For 8 times 8 will always equal 64, even if you call it 100. Their eyes were slightly larger than that of humans, and their noses and mouths were more muzzle-like, with the remnants of superfluous short whiskers protruding from behind their noses. Their ears were softer and larger, and billowed out more so than the ears of humans. In the beginning, their skin was a gray-brown tone, and their fur was black. Later, the skin and fur tones of Tualans would diversify due to exposure to differing environmental conditions, resulting in slightly altered genetic bloodlines. Such subtle differences would later be at the seat of many conflicts and result in the temporary subjugation of groups of individual Tualans that would be perceived by some as inferior races. Like the mammals of Earth, they carried their fertilized eggs internally and gestated them until they were developed enough, then gave birth, much as mammals did. They were in very many respects sisters to the human race. They had organized and built the first Tuala civilization, Watsipia. The dwellings were made almost entirely of mud brick, clay, bark, and vines. They had decided to build there because it was close to where a freshwater river led out into a crystal clear lake. The people of Tuala had learned the power of the seed, and instead of seeking out edible plant material in the wild, exploiting it and moving on, or following the migration routes of the wild animals that they hunted, they now had the knowledge to begin cultivating food on their own and keeping livestock. They created irrigation systems to effectively water the crops, and the yield was always shared freely. None went hungry, and every Tualan that could contribute to their society did so happily. The openings to their houses were surrounded by rows of large, evenly spaced 2-foot-long spikes, and the entrances were built into the ceilings, both to allow for the venting of smoke for when they had need of fire, and to keep out the large nocturnal carnivorous animals from which they still suffered predation. There were guards posted at strategic places around the city, and an ever-expanding shallow wall encircled it, but there was always a chance that one of the fanged crocodilian patraps could find a way in. The elongated shape of the patrap body, combined with its relatively rigid spine, made it impossible for it to climb at any angle greater than 20 degrees or so. They could climb up the banks of the river, but there was no way any of them could scale the right angles of the walls or climb the vertical ladders. Even if some dim-witted patrap were to attempt to scale one of the walls of the dwellings, its back would break under the force of its own weight. Some of the smaller creatures could still freely come and go through the rooftop openings, a few breeds of which posed a danger to children and livestock, the worst among them being the large cats. But there was not so much concern that they felt in any hurry to reinvent the design of their homes. By the time a wild tenanthet cat could become large enough to pose any threat, it would be deterred by the spikes. The Tualans flourished there at Watsipia. It had everything they needed to thrive, and their population began to grow. The only thing it didn't have was the one thing it didn't need: a ruler. In the beginning, there were no kings of Watsipia. No one of them ruled over the people. No few benefited from the labor and exploitation of the many. All was harmonious. Then, over the course of only a few hundred years, their population exceeded the number that could be sustained by their resources, and panic began to set in among the masses when a pending crisis reared its ugly head. As the pending food shortage disaster became ever more abundantly clear, different Tualans with various solutions vied for the favor of the Tualans, offering different ways out of the situation. So they began to divide in their views. Within only a few hundred more years, Watsipia itself, then a sprawling megalopolis, had divided into 3 factions, and the one with the most power and wealth eventually declared war on the other two after they could pay no more tribute and afford no more ransom. The short-lived battles saw not only the return of population growth to sustainable rates, not only sparked the foundation of the city of Latoda much further up the river, peopled by those who had fled during the Watsipian occupation, but also saw the first king of Tawala seated in his throne, King Niajor I, the conqueror of Watsipia. Alexander was aware of where he was, and he was aware of all the happenings in Watsipia and beyond, aware of all of Tawala and all of its creatures, but he hadn't yet made the connection that he was real. He didn't think about it, as he didn't think about anything, but were one to have asked Alexander who he thought that he was during the time of Niajor I and perhaps all the way up until his emergence, he would likely have identified as the mountain in that which he waited, and not as himself. He no longer used his powers to intervene in the lives of the creatures as he had when Tawala was but a fledgling world. He had seen too often the severe consequences of his good intentions gone awry, so often so that he'd stopped interfering with their lives altogether. Despite his desire to spread goodwill, he would not chance the unforeseen any longer. So, he stayed in his mountain as Niajor III led the army of Watsipia to conquer Latoda. He stayed in his mountain as retribution came 2 generations later in the form of chemical warfare, and the innocent people of Watsipia were made to suffer and die, all because they had, as a collective, allowed a ruler to command them. The ordinary soldier need feel no guilt over killing their brother at the command of their king. Over the eons, the Tawalans had spread out across the 5 great continents, and as new resources were discovered, like it were some great cycle, the newfound comfort that the new resources would bring would soon after deteriorate as the demand would again outgrow the supply of goods, and war would ensue once more. Resources were the primary cause of war, but not always. Sometimes war would occur between Tawalan societies based solely on ideological differences such as differing religious or political views. It seemed that they would look for reasons to kill each other even when no good reason existed. Eventually they began to create advanced tools and machines, and warfare became a daily occurrence. For over 1,000 years there had not been a single day without war and bloodshed on Tawala. Someone was suffering somewhere on Tawala every single day. There was some happiness in the households of the common people, but there was also much strife. The wealth of Tawala had been disproportionately distributed, and was not based on the contributions of the constituent parts of their capital ventures as it had been in the first days of civilization, but rather designed so that only a few Tawalans would profit from the fruits of labor of the many. The many Tawalans who actually did the work that so benefited the few that commanded or financed their operations would only receive a meager share of their rewards, proportionate to one another, but completely substandard relative to those who did no work, did nothing more than spend money and make money, who made unthinkable amounts of it and kept it to themselves like so many dragons atop their hoards of gold. And so the true ruler of Tawala reared its ugly head, and its name was greed. Tawala was suffering, and so Alexander was suffering, and so long as he remained in the mountain and refrained from helping, they would continue suffering, but at least he was not alone. Lyelin 12.10, March 28, 2311 AD. As Rosa looked at the exhibit and Emma saw it, it was striking. The story behind it was so famous that the curator needn't explain it at all, but still the curator explained. This, of course, is a representation of elevator number 7 from the Crawford Business Plaza. The amount of damage was staggering. It was hardly even recognizable as an elevator on the left-hand side. It looked as though it had been peeled open from the outside, and there was a gaping hole in the left wall and several other smaller holes around it. Not only the left wall, but the ceiling, the floor, the door especially, the whole left side of the elevator was completely mangled, as if it had burst under too much pressure. History remembered the 30th of April 2030, the day of the elevator incident, not only as the day that video evidence of his spirit was first captured, but also as the day that Daniel Dwyer met Nathaniel Reddington, the curator went on. Investigators would later discover that their connection was much deeper and much older than 2030, as it is now believed that Nathaniel Reddington, the infamous Mr. Red, was somehow inexplicably born with the ability to manipulate Daniel Dwyer, and evidence of him being capable of doing so only emerged later in his lifetime because he had not until then mastered how to use his powers of influence over Daniel. Then the curator stepped up onto the platform with the replica of what had remained of the elevator, and stepped inside of the elevator car, passing right through part of the destroyed door, which became clear as he passed it. It was a holographic projection of the elevator, a perfect representation. The technology was so well done that the shadows of museum patrons would even appear in the appropriate places, integrated into the hologram. The curator invited them to come up into the elevator display, and they did. It wasn't so bad. Emma had seen it before, and even though she still couldn't see it, she enjoyed the novelty of standing in the exhibit. Also, this was one of the more popular exhibits with children, and it was rare that any adult got to enjoy it in peace the way that they had been privileged to do with the private tour. Usually, the display is constantly becoming opaque all over as people approach it from different angles, warbling its image from crisp to near invisible so that patrons do not run into one another while passing through the holographic walls. And children especially like to run back and forth through it just to watch the walls become see-through in front of them. It was nice to see it without it being constantly walked through, even if she was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Rosa said one word when she surveyed the display, which was, "Whoa." "You ain't kiddin'," Emma said. "It's hard to believe that he could ever have been so violent, whether he was thinking for himself or not. It just doesn't seem like Daniel Dwyer." "Yes," the curator said, "it was a different time and he was a product of it. Just as he invariably serves our needs today as is needed, he served invariably the needs of yesterday as was just." Emma looked him in the eye. He was quoting Dwyerist text. She didn't need to ask him if he was a Dwyerist. She knew him as she knew everyone. Emma saw through his eyes. She knew that he was a Dwyerist, and that he was not supposed to endorse any religion as a representative of the museum, and that they were being filmed and broadcast everywhere, and he was risking getting in trouble by quoting out of historical context any religious text from any religion. But he had done it anyway. A few seconds later, when the camera feed reached the crowd outside the museum, a cheer went up so loud that they heard it from inside the museum. They were cheering for the curator. Most of them agreed with what he said. They would abide a God that killed, worship a God that killed. So long as they themselves do not get killed by him, they were happy to agree that it was good that he killed all the people that he killed in his lifetime. That way, they didn't feel in any way wrong for worshiping him. If Daniel Dwyer was the one that did it, then it was justified. This was true in their minds, with the exception, of course, for those acts he performed under the control of Nathaniel Reddington. For those, Reddington alone was forever condemned, for no weapon is guilty of anything. She didn't say anything to him, and she didn't have to. Rosa was going to say it in 3, 2, 1. "Are you allowed to quote from the books of Daniel Dwyer in your position?" she asked, not concerned or complaining, just a little shocked that he had said it for one, and for two, that Daniel Dwyer had allowed him to say it. He had let him break a rule, and had done so allowing for the curator to aggrandize him. He had always wondered himself what would happen if he broke that rule. "I thought not," said the curator, "but apparently I can. He didn't stop me." Emma said, "It is absolutely against the rules, and you're right, he didn't stop you. Do it again." The cameramen, cameras in line and focused, looked out from behind their cameras to see it with their own eyes. The cameramen, Rosa, Emma, and everyone else present looked squarely at the curator to see if he could do it again, to see if Daniel would allow him to do it a second time, and the curator opened his mouth and took a breath in and prepared to speak, but made no sound. He just kept taking starter breaths, but could produce no words. Daniel didn't even appear to explain himself. He knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to test him, and he would pass. He had allowed it once, only because it was one of his favorite quotes. It had been first written by Brother Kevin Gray in the year 2222, when Dwyerist fanaticism was at its height and New Testaments were surfacing left and right. "No," said the curator, "he's not going to let me." It was Daniel Dwyer's world, and Daniel Dwyer was everyone. He had to represent everyone. He had allowed enough and would permit no more. He'd had enough nonsense. The curator could only say that which he was allowed to say, such as it is for all under Daniel's rule, a small price to pay for paradise. He would halt any attempt to utter another syllable of Dwyer's text from him. "That's what I figured," said Emma. "After all that talk about how the museum deals only in fact, you go and try to quote Brother Kevin Gray of the Church of Daniel. I'm surprised he let you do it the first time." "Yes," the curator cleared his throat. "Well, if we are done here, I think you'll quite enjoy this next exhibit." And he led them away, embarrassed by his little moment in the spotlight. He knew he shouldn't have said it, but he figured there would be no harm in trying. If Daniel really didn't want him to say it, he would have stopped him. The projection of the elevator wall became see-through as they approached it, and they stepped off of the platform and went on to the next stop on the tour. The feature was highly interactive, and though they hadn't actively made use of the options, the image did go through a cycle of its display functions by default, and shortly after they had left the platform, the image changed to the before version of the elevator, a projection of what the elevator looked like prior to April 30th, 2030, before it had been utterly annihilated by Daniel Dwyer. It was a powerful display, indicative of the brute strength and power of their god. However, people would have probably felt differently about the elevator display if it had been depicted true to form, with the blood, guts, brains, and chunks of bone that were splattered all over its interior when it was discovered. The man that he'd killed in there, Alfonso Hamilton, was identifiable only by the video evidence, because there was literally nothing left of him by the time Daniel was done and had gone. His body was collected with tweezers from out of cracks and crevices in the wreckage of the elevator and dropped into small bags. There was no toe for the coroner to tag. Nothing that could even be identified as one of his toes was ever found. He had been completely obliterated. Emma Carter was not so fond of the elevator exhibit. It was interesting and all, but she didn't like to be reminded of the violence that Daniel had done in his life. Violence was a thing of the past. It simply was not possible for a person to harm another person anymore. Daniel Dwyer would intervene every time, so it seemed all the more contemptible to her that people celebrated his violent acts when he himself did not condone violence. That wasn't him, though. He couldn't think for himself at the time, people would tell themselves, especially Emma Carter. Emma Carter loved Daniel Dwyer.